Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Uli, and today I'm happy to be joined by Guy Smith. Guy Smith is the mastermind behind GunFacts.info and the author of Guns and Control. Since 2000, Guy has been dismantling myths in the gun control debate with rigorous data, nonpartisan analysis, and a relentless pursuit of truth. From clarifying misconceptions about children and guns to exploring the impact of defensive gun uses, we'll dive into his research, challenge prevailing narratives, and examine how firearms intersect with individual liberty and public policy. Guy, welcome to the show.
Hey, well, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, as I was discussing with you briefly pre-show here, I've been following your work for quite some time, and I really love the information that you put out and make available to those of us who are, in the trenches and arguing and fighting for the right to keep and bear arms. Your infographics are incredible, as well as all the data that you make available to the public. So thank you for the service that you provide. But if you would, here at the beginning, talk a little bit about yourself, the impetus behind Gun Facts, and what other work you have available. I mentioned a book, but I know you've got a lot of other things that you've done as well.
Yeah. Well, the whole genesis of this goes all the way back to when I was in college, and that was back when the skies were littered with pterodactyls. Um, and two things collided rather happily. My degree is in quantitative management sciences, which is a $1,000 term for something that nobody does anymore. But uh, in obtaining that degree, I studied research methodology and design, statistics, all the things that go into it. So when I started to get interested in the topics of guns and violence and what was true and what was not true, I dug into statistical criminology and discovered that I already had the tool set to understand and work that field. So that was kind of a joyous thing. What started it really, though, was one night watching television. Somebody on a national news program talked about the national epidemic of gun violence. And I thought long and hard, and the only gun death that I could think of in my neighborhood, in my city where I lived at the time, was when a psychotic woman charged a police officer with a kitchen knife and he had to shoot her. Other than that, no burglars were shot, no one committed suicide, there was no gunplay in the streets, blah, blah. So that got me very attuned to the idea that people lie. I should not be surprised, but when you get into the political world, a lot of people lie because they have an end goal, and data is extremely inconvenient to everybody. And that's one thing your audience should know. I play it down the middle. I'm nonpartisan. I'm not a member of any organization except for Sons of the American Revolution, and that's just a history club, and I haven't attended a meeting for 20 years. I'm not a member of a political party. So what I and the GunFacts organization does is we listen to the political ether. Half of what we do is we just listen for people to say something about guns, and then we go test their claim. And then we have the lack of couth, which causes us to write about it in detail. So we pick on both sides. The anti-gun crowd is rather prolific in saying dumb and misinformed things that aren't backed up by the data, but the pro-gun crowd slips up once in a while, and we occasionally find some highly inconvenient data for them as well. But the whole goal is to clear the ball field. I want everyone working with good data from sound sources with proper methodologies, and that way the back and forth arguing as people, are working with, different pools of data which, are not congruous, we'll get them aligned little bit by little bit.
So you mentioned your experience back before this started, that you just weren't aware of anybody who had been killed with a firearm other than this one example that you gave. Would you describe yourself as a pro gun person prior to that, or simply was that just an observation that you made that it's interesting that I hear about this so much in the news about all this gun violence, so to speak, and it's not consistent with my experience, at least anecdotally, and I want to look into this. What, how would you characterize that? Your perception at that time?
Well, my perception was neutral. I mean, I grew up Southern, so I was, acquainted with guns, but I was not a gun enthusiast. I knew gun enthusiast, but, I was somebody who would occasionally get dragged to the range and occasionally learn something new. So, that was uh, not an NRA member. I was not somebody who, owned a lot of guns. In fact, when I moved out to California, when I first got out there, not knowing the laws, I left my one and only gun back on the East Coast, because I didn't want to trip up, a possible violation of the law there. So, call it lawful neutral for all the D&D players in your audience. But, I wasn't particularly leaning one way or the other. One of my other passions is constitutional law. I read those great big 5-inch thick books on the subject. And when somebody in college said the Second Amendment was an individual right, I didn't have an opinion about it. But it caused me to do a hell of a lot of reading, and eventually came to the immutable conclusion that yes, it is an individual right. And over the course of time, I've had a chance to meet a couple of constitutional law scholars. I had a conversation with Kil Lamar. I've known Eugene Volokh since he was a teenager. And I've got to ask these people about it. And their reactions are always the same, whether they like the idea of the Second Amendment or they don't like the idea. They all 100% say, yes, it is an individual right. Even Kil Lamar, who refers to himself as a liberal Democrat, when I asked him, is it an individual right, his head dropped like this. And he said, yes, it is.
Yeah. Well, and the question, and you often get that concession from, as you alluded to, from people on the political left, that yeah, it is an individual right, but to what degree can it be regulated or controlled? And so that's where even the people on the left who think that it's an individual right, um, to what degree do they think the government can control that right? Is where the rubber always meets the road. Um, and speaking of which, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about your book, Guns and Control, before we get into to the meat of some more specific topics.
That was a fun book. I had been doing gun facts for over 20 years and I was drowning in data. And the GunFacts website is very serviceable for people to find quick information and whatnot. But it occurred to me that some people, they can't dive into the middle of mucky data like that and then find a gestalt. So I wanted to write a book that took people from A to Z without drowning them in data, a little bit of a light read at times, so that they could wrap their brains around every part of the guns, violence, crime, self-defense scenarios and have a full understanding of it. So there's chapters on everything in there, on gun availability, on mass public shootings, on defensive gun uses, international comparisons, et cetera, et cetera. And anyone who has been to GunFacts.info knows that we are stupid about creating charts and graphs. And so the book is fully littered with those things. And if you're going to buy a copy of the book, I highly recommend getting the digital version because all the graphs are in color.
Oh, okay, excellent. Well, and speaking of the graphs and the infographics that you have on the website, I'm going to put that up here just briefly so that people can see what a great resource that is. Anybody who's watching the podcast by video, you can see we're at gunfacts.info on the infographics page. So if you just hit the infographics menu at the top, it'll take you to this page with a ton of infographics that you've made available here to the public. So yeah, you're not getting just the raw data. You're getting some very easy to understand, very easy to read infographics here to help understand the data.
Well,
So
and
as
if you go to any of the topic sections that were underneath there, such as if you clicked on mass public shooting, there's going to be charts and graphs specific to that topic. And one thing that I want everyone to know is that if you click on any of those charts and graphs, you're going to get a much bigger shareable version of the graph. And the copyright that we have for anything on the GunFacts website is that you are free to share it, providing that you do not modify the graphic. So if you're having an online discussion with somebody about a particular topic, come to our site, grab the chart that demonstrates it. Almost all the charts down the lower left-hand corner cite the sources that were used for the data, and then share that online.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'll just put up one of the higher. So here, if you click on one of the infographics, this is what comes up, and you can see that they're pretty high resolution. They're easy to read and to zoom in on some of the smaller text in the charts. So, fantastic resource there. One thing I want to mention, you've got a number of topics here, but you've also got, let's see, the books page. I want to show that very quickly here. Books. And there's not, I mean, Guns and Control is the one there at the top, but there are a number of other books here as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the books that you've listed here?
Well, the books I've listed are what I consider to be high quality data and analysis books. These are been produced by criminologists or other analyst groups or people who have specific point knowledge that I think is important. And these are books that we've ingested, that we've learned a bit from, and that not only is the data of high quality, but the readability of the book generally is. About the only exception is Targeting Guns by Kleck, which is an absolute masterpiece in terms of the data behind guns. It's a little outdated nowadays, but it's a great book. But it was definitely written for other criminologists. So, if you don't want to do a deep dive and have your eyes cross, as you're getting down to the fifth layer of the data minutia, Targeting Guns might be a little thick for you. But nonetheless, fantastic book.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you've got Second Amendment studies. So it's not just criminology. It's not just data related stuff. You've got Stephen Hallbrook is listed here, and a number of others as well who his aren't so data heavy, but are always well cited. So I know that's a great resource that you list specifically, That Every Man Be Armed, which I know is an excellent book. All right, so let's get into a few of the specific topics from your website. There are a number, but I want to talk about a few, and we'll start with, if it's okay, the children and guns issue, because this is one that is often referenced or cited by the media as a reason to impose more gun control. What are some of the most common myths that you hear when in the discussion regarding children and guns?
Well, the number one is that the activist group intentionally, I believe, but I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. They keep amalgamating children and teenagers. And this is a fatal flaw in their presentation. Both the criminology field and the epidemiology fields have a hard, bright line between children and teens. Criminologists, the dividing point is age 13. Epidemiologists is 14. That makes data analysis a little messy from time to time. But there's very specific reasons for that. When one hits puberty, one's entire outlook on life changes. You begin to spend less time at home and more time with your peer groups. You enter riskier behaviors because you're testing your own boundaries all the time. So what happens to children who are, largely kept at home and looked after very consistently and constantly versus what happens to teenagers is radically different. So some activist groups keep putting out this meme that says guns are the number one killers of children. And it is hogwash. If we accept the definition of child as anyone who's under the age of 14, the death rate by guns is approaching zero. Let's break that down into two parts. Accidental gun deaths. Changes a tiny bit from year to year, but it's basically one child per state per year. So for your audience members, think about the state that you live in and think about last year there was one accidental child gun death. And as a quick aside, I'll note that a lot of these accidental deaths have dovetails into street gang behavior, and we can go into more of that later. So, it's a sloppiness factor of people who are living a criminal lifestyle. If you look at all gun deaths, which includes the accidentals, kids who get hit in a drive-by shooting, occasionally homicides by a family member, stuff like that, we're still under 500 children per year, which then boils down to about 10 kids per state per year. And that's 10 more than any of us would like. But when you look at the total number of children in any given state or in the country, 10 is actually an incredibly small number. And this is during a period when the number of handguns in circulation has been going up steadily since the early 1990s. So there's more handguns in circulation, but the number of kids who are dying from guns keeps going down and down. So the meme you hear from some activist groups, terrible. Reason is that they include teenagers. Now, according to the National Gang Center, which was a project of the federal government which spent several years doing a fairly massive research study on gangs, gang recruitment begins at age 14, right at the beginning of the teenage years. And that's understandable for a lot of sociological reasons, which we can dive into later. But the fact is that teenage kids join gangs, they get guns through their gangs, they demonstrate reckless behavior, they're in a place and a time and traveling with people who are being targeted by rival gangs. So the number of teenagers who get killed in gang activity is phenomenally high. And the activist groups that amalgamate teens and children and then call that entire cluster children, or their new euphemism is kids, they're just deceiving the public.
Yeah, and I'm going to put up a chart just to illustrate this point that you're making. You've got on your website under the children and guns portion this chart available that shows child firearms deaths and handgun availability, and you can see that the death rate has been falling as the handgun availability numbers have been increasing. So I think this perfectly illustrates, and it looks like it runs from 1993, this chart, to 2011. So there's a pretty wide span of time there that's captured by this chart. Do you have any ideas if this particular trend has been staying like this the last 14 years or so?
Yeah, I do from, digging through the data, but I'm glad that you put that chart up because looking at 2011 tells me that I need to set aside an hour and update that chart.
And what do you know about the data since that time?
Well, I know from the CDC data that the level of gun deaths for children has basically remained flat for the 21st century.
And I assume that the handgun availability numbers have continued to increase. Is that true?
I believe that's true. Every 2 years, I tried to download the next set of firearms and commerce reports from the ATF and update a different data table that we have with all that data. And I have not seen any indication that there's a slowdown in handgun sales.
And of course, the this 2011 would have been toward the end of President Obama's first term. And of course, he is widely known, especially during his presidency, as one of the best gun salesmen of all time. So I would imagine that the handgun availability continued to increase, especially through his presidency. I think even beyond that, in fact, but I don't have the numbers at hand.
Yeah, I had a real congenial conversation once with a upper echelon person in an anti-gun group. And because, we weren't being adversarial, we got to talk about a lot of things. And she asked me, you know, what could we do to slow down the number of guns in society? And I said, well, first, quit trying to take them away, because a lot of people will go out and buy a gun if they think that, it's not going to be there tomorrow. But the bigger thing to do is to keep working on crime, because survey after survey after survey shows that people buy guns when they perceive crime is getting worse. And here's one of the great mysteries, is that since 1993, which is the year that violent crime peaked in the United States and fell like a rock for all the years afterwards, firearm sales keep going up. Crime's going down, firearm sales are going up. And in the modern context, when we have violent crime levels back down to about late 1960s level, people on surveys still report that they are scared about being a victim of violent crime. And that's what drives them to buy more guns. To quote the moral philosopher Marilyn Manson, we don't live in more violent times, we live in more televised times.
Yeah.
And I think the public has a general misperception about their probability of being harmed by violence.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've heard. I have a few questions based on your comments here. Um, Number one, there's been a lot of discrepancy in media sources about whether or not the violent crime rate has in fact been falling or not. There's been some. I think maybe John Lott talks about this, and I don't want to misquote him, but I think he talks about there being a significant degree of underreporting of crime, and I don't know to what degree, or if it would be enough underreporting to change the trend, of downward um, uh, commissions of crime. But the other thing is that I think you mentioned televised. We live in a televised society. I think the other thing is that social media also contributes to this perception that we live in more dangerous or volatile times. Do you have any sense for how public perception has been shaped by social media?
I don't have any hard data, no measurements that tell us how much social media affects things, but I did have a conversation with two different homicide detectives on two different dates. And we were talking about the fact that gang culture, street gang culture, um, is leaking into suburbs and even into small towns. Um, and in talking to them, their opinion was twofold, that formalized gang activity may not be actually more present within inside of small suburbs and small towns, but because of the internet, people in those areas can absorb gang culture. The gangs are amazingly prolific in terms of videotaping themselves and putting it up on YouTube and bragging about their gang activities. So we've got a new paradigm in the United States whereby street gang violence used to be, and it still is, but used to be almost exclusively uh, inner cities, major metro areas, poor neighborhoods, and nowhere else. But it's beginning to bleed out into other areas. And the internet and social media facilitated that.
Yeah. And speaking of gangs, I want to bring up another point that you make on your website. The myth is that 13 children are killed each day by guns. And you really hammer home this point that the statistics include children up to age 19 or 24, depending on the source. Can you talk a little bit? I think it's intuitive as to why that might be a problem, but can you talk a little bit about why that's an issue?
Well, and definitions are always the boogeyman. Whenever I download some academic study that's getting news coverage, one of the things I look at is how do they define certain terms. Um, and in the past, certain activist groups have completely morphed the definition of children. Um, and I can almost understand why they go up to age 19. It's too far of a stretch and definitely violates the definition of child. But when I saw a couple of them go all the way up to 24, then, you just knew that they needed bigger numbers and they weren't going to get bigger numbers unless they completely violated the definition of what a child is. And this doesn't seem to be slowing down much. Um, One thing I have noticed, because I waste way too much time on Twitter, is that the the veil has been ripped off. Enough people now understand the amalgamation of children and teenagers and sometimes young adults into the data. And the pushback against the activist groups is very, very strong now. I don't even have to speak up anymore. The moment that they flash an incorrect meme, there's at least, 100 people who are busy correcting them. But it's not going to stop because it's too easy of a tool. And one of the points of propaganda is to repeat something often enough that somebody who does not have the leisure to dig into the data will believe it, because if you hear something enough times from enough different sources and enough different angles, you'll start to believe it yourself.
Yeah, and I agree with you that there's been this counterbalance, I think, on social media that, like you say, when some bad information is posted, there's almost immediately not just a singular person responding, but a multitude of people responding to that inaccurate data. Um, but one thing I want to mention here too on this subject is that you alluded to this earlier, but that most violent crime is committed by males age 16 to 24. So this gets back to the point you were making earlier that when you exclude those males, those people who have the tendency to commit more crimes, the number of children, so-called children, who are killed each day drops precipitously, and you get to that one child a day that you were talking about earlier. Um, can you say a little bit about the difference in the crime rate between children as the children defined as children up to 13 or 14 years old, and then the 16 to 24-year old age cohort in terms of the crime rates?
Yeah, well, for children itself, being a victim of a crime is almost immeasurable. It is such a low number. And while you have that one chart up on the page there, we'll note in passing that when it comes to homicide of children, parents are the number one cause. Um, Now, that's homicides by any means, not just guns, but it gives you an idea of for the tiny number of children who actually get killed with guns, that the source isn't randomized crime. But when you get above age 14, we start cycling into the street gang thing again. Um, we did a chart, and I don't know what page I buried it on, but we took the demographic definition of the most common elements of street gang members, and then we used CDC firearm homicide data and mapped that. The three vectors are age, and National Gang Center, definitely said from 14 up to about age 24 is the hot spot. Being male is a given. Um, Race is another factor in there. And then the degree of urbanicity is the final factor. When you map all those together and then you use CDC data to draw the chart, what you see is kind of what we already knew, which is that the highest firearm death rate that you're going to find is for teenage or young adult males, black, in the inner city. The rate of firearm deaths for them is astronomical. Um, Yet it's not the primary point that politicians want to try to provide a solution for. If we could wave a magic wand tomorrow, and there's a blog up on the website called Gang Triangulation. This is where we triangulated what the probable number of percentage of firearm homicides that are gang related. If you could wave a magic wand and get rid of street gangs tomorrow, our homicide rate in the United States would be equal to or lower than most Western European nations.
Wow. I will try to find that and link to it in the show notes so that people have access to it. I assume, yeah, I'll just do a search for that and put it link it in the show notes because I think that would be an interesting resource for people to go and see. What kind of impact, if any, do so-called safe storage laws have on the homicides or the death rate of children by firearms?
I wish I knew. We started a study earlier this year, and we ran into a data roadblock. To do a quality study on this, we would need the firearm, non-fatal firearm injury rates per state. And unfortunately, that data is only available from one source, and it would cost me $1,000 per state per year. So $50,000 times however many years I want to do the study. Since we don't take institutional money, and boy, that hurts because we have turned down some big checks from, policy groups. We're never going to be able to complete that study unless somebody wants to jailbreak that data and pass it to us under the table. So safe storage can't comment on because it's just, the data is incomplete.
Okay. Well, and speaking of which, I'm glad you brought it up. I should have asked you this at the very beginning. How are you funded? And if folks want to donate money to GunFacts.info, how do they do that?
We are funded 100% by our fans. We turn down institutional money. We never ask for institutional money. And people donate to us in one of two modes. We try to do a fundraiser every year, and we basically end up spamming everyone who has signed up for our blog post and other information. Plus, we go out to social media and, ring the bell out there. But a lot of people make a small contribution every month via PayPal, and the average donation is about $5. But because of that, we have a small but consistent income stream, and that is helping us get to some places that we had only dreamed of before. We have an internal project, forgive the language, but we internally call it data whore. And we are putting together an SQL database, and we are acquiring data from NACJD, the National Archive of Criminal Justice Data. And bit by bit, we're loading decades worth of data into one repository where we can instantly pull up any query that we want. We'll also be doing the same thing with census data so that we can cross map down to the county level for our future studies. And we wouldn't be able to do that if people weren't making that monthly donation.
Fantastic. And while you were speaking there, I went to your page and found the donate tab. If you go to gunfacts.info, there's a donate tab at the very top right next to the search box. You can go to that donate tab and you'll see the place there where you can make a one-time contribution via PayPal or a recurring contribution also via PayPal. And then there are some other options there as well. I like to see that you accept Bitcoin. I'm a Bitcoin uh, advocate myself, and so I'm happy to see more people taking that. But you also have other methods as well. So if people out there, if you're listening and you want to support the work that GunFacts.info is doing, go to GunFacts.info and go to the donate tab, and you'll find the place to donate there. All
And
right.
while
So,
you're,
go ahead.
yeah, and also up on that top menu, you'll see something that says alerts and volunteers. And if you want to get on our mailing list for our new research, and it's extremely low volume, you'll hear from us maybe once a month. Just sign up there, and anytime we have some new analysis, you'll be the first to know.
Great. Yeah, and I've put that page up here on the screen as well, and I'll be sure to link to both of these in the show notes. All right, so we've barely touched on the children and guns issue. There's so much more to talk about there, but I want to get to just a couple of other issues. Just there's a crime and guns section on your page as well, and you talk a lot about, you know, for instance, that most guns involve handguns and not so-called assault rifles. Can you talk about the breakdown of the data there?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that a lot of people don't know is that data in this field is occasionally not great. There's occasionally great big missing holes and gaping data. So the numbers don't always add up to 100%. But the one thing that we do know is that day in, day out crimes where the police have been able to determine what firearm was used, we see just under about 50% of crimes involving handguns. But the other categories, rifles, 2.6%, shotguns, 1.4%, and then that leaves 24% where the cops can't figure out what gun was used. And one of the good but frustrating things about our criminal data collection system is that the officers are not allowed to guess. They are not allowed to say, well, it looked like a 9mm slug we pulled out of the wall, so we're going to assume it's a handgun. No, that's a no-no. So that's why we end up with 24% unknown. That's also why when you look at crime data for homicides, the supplemental homicide tables by the FBI, the largest category of circumstances is unknown. The homicide detectives aren't allowed to guess what caused one person to kill another person, so they put it down as a blank.
One of the, in addition to the breakdown of what types of arms are used in crime, on this page, this crime and guns page, you break down a number of other myths as well. And one of those is that guns are not a good deterrent to crime. And you link to a number of charts and data to refute that particular myth. And one that I thought was interesting that you don't hear a lot, at least with solid data, is that 60% of convicted felons admitted they had avoided committing crimes when they knew the victim was armed. And 40% of convicted felons admitted that they avoided committing crimes when they thought the victim might be armed. Can you talk a little bit about where that data comes from? Is that somebody who's going into a jail or a prison and collecting that? Where does that data come from? And can you extrapolate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I like to tell people that occasionally a criminologist will break into prison and then they will survey inmates. They give them a clean pass. Anything that they say is off the record, will not be used to, extend their sentence or anything like that. And then they ask them a lot of questions. And this is also the same technique that the Bureau of Justice Statistics uses about every decade to try to figure out how criminals are getting their hands on guns. So they go in and ask a lot of questions, and I'm terrible with names, so I'm not going to try to remember which criminologist had done these studies. But there were at least two where they did this, and they asked the question, "What is your attitude about committing your crimes if there's a possibility that you're going to get pushback?" And the large number of criminals who said that this is something that they think about and then that they will change their behavior if they are in doubt, I think says a lot about the passive deterrence offense. One of the illustrations I like to give people is imagine a neighborhood, two driveways next to each other. In the driveway on the left, there's a Prius with a coexist bumper sticker on the back, and the other driveway has a 4x4 pickup truck with an NRA sticker on the back. Whose house do you think is going to get robbed? It's probably not the one with the pickup truck. So criminals, as dumb as they are, at least have the fundamental reasoning skills to say, yes, regular people do have guns, and I need to factor this into my equation because being dead is not profitable.
Yeah, criminals are often bad at risk analysis, right? Or else they wouldn't be committing most of the crimes that they commit. But they understand what it means when somebody has a gun while they're attempting to commit a crime. So they understand that potential risk. And in fact, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I've heard this. Uh, I believe it was from John Lott as well about the number of what are considered hot burglaries in the UK as compared to the United States, and that is burglaries where the person is home, the house is occupied, and the number in the UK is much higher. I believe somewhere in the 60% range, while it's less than 20% in the United States. And of course, we can speculate as to why, but the implication is that the burglar suspects that the person in the United States might actually be home and have a firearm, whereas they don't fear that the homeowner will have a firearm in the UK. Are you familiar with the data that I'm referring to there?
I'm sure I've read them at one point or another. I've not incorporated them into my few remaining brain cells to pop it off the top.
Yeah.
But it's unsurprising to me. Criminals will do hot home invasions here in the U.S., but again, they tend to be very selective. They map out the neighborhoods, they look at the dynamic, they try to make educated guesses about the probability of success of the burglary, et cetera, et cetera. So it doesn't surprise me that in the UK, where the probability of facing one of the few people who still has a license for a shotgun, um, it makes their probability of success that much higher. And so, you take the risk out of the equation, the reward to risk ratio changes dramatically.
Yeah. And one of the things you've got a ton of charts here on the guns and crime page, as you do on most of the pages. But I think these charts illustrate that a lot of the successful deterrence of firearms ownership that never involves an actual shooting. And so often, I think that the gun control advocates try to cast, the effectiveness of guns as if they're only effective when they're actually discharged or actually fired in self-defense. Do you have a sense for the how often firearms are a deterrent, even when they're not fired, as compared to when they are actually fired?
Yeah, that's definitely up on our website. I don't recall the breakdown off the top of my head. But there are so many multiple ways of defending yourself with a firearm that if you tried to add them all up, it actually adds up to way more than 100%. And that's because somebody might exercise more than one mode during a particular episode. When I give a stump speech, I say, okay, step number one, tell the person on the other side of the door that you have a gun. Step number two, chamber a round or a shell so they hear that you have a gun. Step number three, show them that you have a gun. Step number four, stand there low ready to indicate that, yes, I will use a gun. Step number five, point the gun at them to say, yes, I'm serious, I will use the gun. Step number six, fire a warning shot, purposely missing them so that you really communicate that, yes, I can use this gun. Step number 7, shoot them with the intent to wound but not kill. Step number 8, put one between their eyes. So 8 different levels of defensive gun use. Now, here's where the activists drive me crazy. They will go and cite one bit of data. I forget what the round number is, but basically they only cite the number of criminals who were killed by somebody with a firearm. And they say, you see that? There's almost no defensive gun uses. And I tell them, well, you just eliminated 7 out of 8 of the possible ways to defend yourself with a gun. And that's why your numbers are incredibly off. Now, up on the GunFacts website, we have a beautiful chart. It started off by stealing the data from Gary Kleck, who had been collecting defensive gun use survey information for a long time, and we've since been adding to it. And I think there's 13 different high-quality surveys in there showing a range of the rates of defensive gun uses, and the average of them is just below 2 million times a year. Kleck's study came in at 2.5. His was not the high number. The high number was Los Angeles Times, I believe. They went out and hired Roper Survey to do a big study. Anyone who wants that data, you got to cough up $400 to Roper. And they came in at 3 million times a year. So the real number to communicate is at least 2 million times a year through all 8 different modes of defensive gun uses. And if we start thinking about social cost of being victimized by crime, the skewing of the net social benefit of defensive gun uses has to be explored. That is such a big number that we have to assume that it is a significant contributor to keeping the cost of random violence down.
And I've done a fair amount of study and instruction on the use of deadly force, and while most deadly force, most instructors on the use of deadly force wouldn't advise a warning shot or shooting to wound, the fact is, right, that those are possible permutations of what might actually happen during a defensive gun use, and a lot of times those are not captured by the data, along with these other, various stages of a potential defensive gun use. So I think that's a great illustration of why the data is so skewed in many cases. All right, so last thing I want to chat about, because we're just a little bit over 45 minutes now, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. Do you have any sense for how so-called constitutional carry or permitless carry has impacted the misuse of or criminal use of firearms, if at all? And then finally, I want you to just plug GunFacts.info and anything we haven't mentioned regarding your website or the other work that you have going.
I would love to be able to say something definitive about that, but we ran into a interestingly weird problem with data. Starting in 1993, for 4 years, 24 states with over half of the country's population all passed habitual offender laws, 3 strikes laws. And you can see it in the data, the rate at which incarcerations went up. And slightly before that, there were a raft of laws passed in various states called truth in sentencing laws, so that, people who committed a crime actually did their time. But at the same time was the beginning of the tidal wave of shall issue legislation. Florida, where I lived at the time, 1988, was the first major state to pass shall issue. At that time, only 10 states allowed people to carry in public, and one of them was Vermont, and they just never bothered to outlaw in the first place. And then within inside of a decade and a half, we were up to 42 states. So at the same time that concealed carry was going up like this, so was incarceration of violent people, and the crime rate was going down. There is no way, I believe, to untangle the two. It would require creating a questionable model, and I don't like questionable models, and it might end up misleading people. The one thing that we can say, though, with perfect clarity, is that it has not made the problem worse. There are not more homicides, there are not more gun homicides with a radically larger number of people carrying guns in public. It went the opposite direction. So we can say no harm. I can't say for certain whether it had a positive effect on the crime rate or not. It would be wonderful to find out, but there's no way to untangle that mess. But this gets right back to a different study that we did. We wanted to study whether states switching to permitless carry, what some people call constitutional carry, made things worse. And we discovered that it didn't. Most of the states that went permitless were already shall issue states. So one can argue that people who wanted to carry were already carrying. So the mechanics didn't change. But it also highlighted that people who misuse guns don't bother with permits. They never have. They never will. Most of them aren't allowed to be in the same zip code as a gun. So, they're going to acquire and carry guns regardless of what the law says. So we may be in a situation where public carry may not have an incredibly large impact in terms of lowering the violent crime rate, but it definitely has an individual impact because when crime does come your way, you're the first responder.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know that this is not the most common scenario, but there are people who are involved in a domestic, relationship that's turned bad and maybe hadn't been carrying a firearm up to that point, and fear for their life for one reason or another, and don't have time to wait for a license necessarily. So those are the sorts of people who benefit, I think, in the immediate term from not having the burden of having to obtain a license, aside from the philosophical and the political aspects of licensing an individual right. I think the practical impact is on those sorts of folks as well. So, yeah, I'm glad to hear anyway that there hasn't been a noticeable negative impact, but it sounds like there's not really been much of an impact either way. So anyway, glad to hear that. And of course, like you say, I think that it makes sense that that would be a difficult issue to untangle, where the habitual offender laws came into to effect at about the same time that many states went to shall issue or permitless carry. So that makes complete sense. So in wrapping up the episode here, if you would just plug GunFacts.info, tell us if there's any place else we can find out about the work that's going on there, social media or otherwise, and then we'll wrap up the show.
I will do that. I do want to encourage everyone to go to gunfacts.info, and while you're there, key in the search bar the phrase top 15, and it's going to show you a major piece of research we did last year. This is arguably one of the most compelling things we've ever done. What we discovered was that in the United States, there are 15 counties that make up 0.5% of all the counties in the United States. Those counties have 0.8% of the population, but they account for 25% of the gun homicides. I want people to internalize that. A quarter of the gun homicides are in 15 counties. And we tested against 24 different confounding variables to try to narrow this all down. And it comes down to two things. Does a county have the probability of having the demographics for having a lot of street gang members, and are the police understaffed? Those two things go hand in hand, and That's what creates places like Cook County, Illinois, home of Chicago, where there are neighborhoods that are shooting galleries. Less than half of the homicides go resolved, and the gangs continue to run free. If there was one policy recommendation that we would make, and GunFacts avoids making policy recommendations, but it would be to relentlessly focus on street gangs and the mega killers, because every street gang has a handful of members who are just absolutely ruthless, and start dismantling the gangs and the gang culture as fast as possible. So GunFacts.info, if you go to either Facebook, Twitter, or X, I guess I should be calling it, or even LinkedIn, you can just go ahead and look for GunFacts and you'll find us pretty quickly. On Twitter, which is where I spend way too much time, it's going to be at GunFacts.
Fantastic. Well, Guy Smith, thank you so much for your time to joining the Forge of Freedom. And I hope all our listeners got a little something from this episode and will be clued in to your website now, gunfacts.info. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. As always, you can find the episodes on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and X at Forge of Freedom and at forgeoffreedom.com. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.